What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I'm Kevin Smith. Today's episode is going to be a Q&A. Just got finished with an early morning interval session on the rower, and now here I am about to dive into some questions. I've got a few questions from last week. I got way more questions last week, and there were a few of them that were pretty good that I didn't get to in last week's episode. So I've got those ones, as well as some questions from this week's Q&A to get to today. So let's hop into the questions. The first one is, I'm going to have to translate the question a little bit because it's a little bit missing a few words, but it's an important thing that I get asked about a lot. So we'll hop into that, and I'll do a somewhat, I'm not going to do a deep dive, of course, but I'll get into a little bit of specifics on it and provide some examples, and we'll go from there. So the question as written is, how big of a factor does a person's genetics actually determine their potential? What I believe they mean is, how big of a factor does a person's genetics play in determining their potential? So we will answer that question. The answer to this question is a significant and measurable factor, but also there's no way to actually specifically measure it. So you definitely will see differences in genetics and someone reaching their potential, but there's no way to actually, that I'm aware of, to actually quantify just how much of a percent genetics plays. And it's going to play a factor in multiple different things. Some people are born with extremely smart and bright brains. Some people will have IQs in the high 100s. There have been people that allegedly have IQs over 200. And there are people with IQs that are room temperature. So genetics play a huge role in intelligence. They play a role in your charisma. They play a role in the way you look, the way you carry yourself. Obviously, nurture also plays a role in all of these things as well, not just nature. But some people might be really good at playing the violin the first time they ever try it. And when they continue to practice, they're going to be better than almost anyone else in the violin. Because even if someone practices more than a person that is just naturally gifted, they might not make it. The same can be said for athletics. In certain sports, I like to kind of categorize sports that involve multiple measures of performance versus sports that are more single discipline. Like, for example, a 100-meter sprinter would be more of a single discipline thing. And a sport like basketball or baseball or football, typical sports that, people watch on TV, would be more of a multifactorial sport or athletic endeavor. And genetics play a role in both of those. However, if someone doesn't have necessarily great genetics for sprinting, lifting weights, or jumping, whatever that may be, they can still be good at a sport that is not solely based on your ability to do all those things. I like to use a few examples. So Larry Bird, for example, the only favorable genetics he had for basketball was that he was tall. He was about 6'9". So although that is not overly tall for NBA, it's still above average height. I believe that average height in the NBA is like 6'7", but he was not very fast. He couldn't jump very well. He wasn't very quick, and overall largely had poor genetics to be a pro basketball player, let alone one of the best basketball players to ever live. And if you don't agree with me on that, I don't care. I'm a Boston fan, so Larry Bird is probably top 5 of all time. That's my opinion, but I think it's correct. Either way, even though he would not have won a vertical leap contest or a contest to see who can dribble full court in the fewest dribbles or the shortest amount of time, he still dominated on the basketball court, mostly because although his genetics were not physically advantageous, he had great genetics in regards to basketball IQ. He had great genetics in regards to coordination, hand-eye coordination, the ability to shoot, and the ability to make defenders look silly were things that he was naturally gifted for, but also that he worked his ass off and practiced probably harder than almost anyone ever to live. And therefore, he became dominant on the basketball court. But if you ask Larry Bird to run a 100-meter sprint as fast as possible, he wouldn't do very well. If you asked him to run a 400-meter sprint as fast as possible, he probably wouldn't do very well, relatively speaking, compared to other people. And then you have more current guys like Stephen Curry. Steph Curry is below average in regards to basketball athleticism. If you're talking about vertical leap, quickness, explosiveness, speed, he's below average compared to other guys in the NBA. However, his hand-eye coordination is probably the best of almost any athlete of all time. And also he is extremely intelligent. His basketball IQ is off the charts, and he makes people look silly as well. Whereas you have someone like LeBron James or Michael Jordan, those guys are absolute freaks. LeBron James could easily, probably, if he just spent a little bit more time dedicated to football, he probably could have played football as a tight end in the NFL or a defensive end or something like that. Or Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was one of the most naturally athletically gifted dudes of all time. Of course, his basketball skill, his basketball IQ was extremely high, which is the main reason it makes him the greatest of all time. And he was off the charts competitive as well. So those are all those are all examples of how genetics play a role in sports that involve multiple disciplines. But just because you don't have the ability to jump extremely high or change directions extremely quick, or you're not super fast, you still can perform well in those sports. And you can perform better than a lot of guys in like Steph Curry and Larry Bird example. You can perform better than a lot of guys around you who are significantly more naturally athletic. Raw athleticism is what I would kind of describe it as. So then you have other sports that are less skill-based and more raw athleticism-based. Of course, you have to practice. Of course, you have to train really hard. But you have sports like Olympic sports, such as running 100 meters or 200 meters. Like you've got Usain Bolt. No matter what, if anyone else in the world trained just as hard or harder, ate better, Usain Bolt is infamous for his poor diet. When he was at the Olympics, he would eat like chicken McNuggets, basically like 60 plus a day, I believe it was, when he was at the Olympics. I don't remember what year it was, but you could have people who are way more dialed in than Bolt. And obviously the statistics and evidence shows that they're still not going to beat him because he had incredible sprinting genetics. He also worked hard, but he also had perfect sprinting genetics that got him to where he was as one of the greatest shorter distance sprinters of all time. Then you have guys like Eliud Kipchoge, who is a marathon runner, widely considered to be one of, if not the best marathon runners of all time. If Kipchoge were to try and take up short distance sprinting, he would not fare as well because his muscle fiber types are slower twitch, and he would not be as dominant at sprinting because he has a very high VO2 max. He has a very high lactate threshold. His muscle fiber type is mostly slow twitch. He was born and raised with really good genetics because most people who are born in Africa, the area of Africa he's from, I believe it's from Kenya. Kenya and Ethiopia usually produce the best marathon runners. They are born with natural ability to be really good runners, long distance runners, but also they grow up in an environment where they just run all the time. And they don't need a lot of food. They don't need a lot of water. A lot of them run barefoot. So that is kind of a component of nature and nurture. But Kipchoge is still the best because even though a bunch of other guys still grew up in that same area that are still high-level marathoners, he has proven to outperform all of them. And a lot of that has to do with genetics. We won't get into any PEDs here because arguably many of these athletes, regardless of the sport, potentially do use PEDs, which also can make a big difference. But at the same time, if everyone's using them, then it's still a matter of genetics, hard work, dedication, mental strength, things like that. But that just goes to show that genetics play a massive role. So let's tie this into a regular person that is just trying to potentially chase some sort of fitness goal. If you were born with extreme fast twitch muscle fiber genetics, you can run fast, you can jump high, you're really strong, you probably will struggle a little bit with endurance-based events. You'll probably struggle a little bit with longer distance running. You'll probably struggle a little bit with rucking. You'll probably struggle a little bit with things that involve higher endurance, longer duration endurance. You may not have the highest VO2 max. VO2 max is largely genetic. It can be altered by training. And it typically, unless you fight against it, it's going to decline with age. But some people are just born with extremely high VO2 maxes, which is basically how efficiently your body uses oxygen. So if you have a higher VO2 max, that is one of many, probably one of like 3 different extremely important things in regards to like running. Your VO2 max is one factor that will make you potentially a really good runner. Your lactate threshold will also play a role in that, as well as your running economy, which is just a fancy calculation for how efficient you are at running. But if you were born with low VO2 max, if your lactate threshold is pretty low and you don't have the best running economy because probably you gravitate towards things that you were better at when you're growing up, most likely most people do that, then it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to get faster and improve. That being said, the theme is going to be, for this entire question, you can't really do anything about your genetics. So you still can pursue things if you have goals that involve endurance, like for example, selection, and you don't have the best genetics for running and rucking longer distances. That doesn't mean it's impossible. You absolutely can do it. It's just going to be a little harder for you, and you might not be winning everything. You might not be the fastest guy there. And that doesn't matter. You still absolutely can make it and be successful and be a great special operator. So you, on the other side of the spectrum, like, I would consider myself to have more endurance-based genetics. I've always been a pretty solid runner. I can go long periods of time without running. Not that I do very often, but I can, and still beat a lot of people in runs. I'm not a high-level runner by any means. Like, I would get absolutely smashed by, competitive runners, mostly because I'm, 30, 40, 50 pounds heavier than most of them. But at the same time, running comes a lot more naturally to me, and I don't have to put as much work in to be good enough at it. And when I do put a lot of work in, I become quite good at running and rucking and everything like that. But when it comes to trying to gain muscle and trying to gain strength, I have to put a lot more work in because I have mostly slow twitch muscle fibers. I'm just more slow twitch in nature. I've never been like a super fast sprinter. I've never been able to jump super high. And I have never been the first time I went to the gym, I wasn't super strong. I had to really work at it. There are people, I went to a high school with a kid who literally had never lifted weights before. And the first time he went into the gym, he benched 225. There are examples of people that are now competitive strongmen, but the first time they ever lifted, they deadlifted 450 or 500 pounds. So there are people like that. And a lot of that is genetics. But of course, when you have that genetic base and you put the work in and you put the consistency in and you continue to work at something that you're already really good at, you're just going to get better and better and better. And that's kind of the theme with genetics is you can't change it. You can't do anything about it. You were born and your parents are going to determine what you have the natural propensity towards, whether it's being really strong, being really muscular, being really lean, but skinny and having difficulty putting muscle on, but maybe being really good at running. Whether you are, really bright and extremely intelligent and you thrive in situations like that. Maybe you are a master piano player or a master chess player, whatever it may be. There are things that you do for the first time. They just come really easy to you. And when you continue to work at them, you get better and better and better. And you get exponentially better at other people that maybe are doing the same work. They just don't have the genetic predispositions as you. So all that to say is genetics definitely play a role, but at the same time, you can't do anything about it. And a lot of people believe that they've reached their genetic potential. And I would beg to differ. I think most people have not reached their genetic potential really in anything. It would be really, really hard to reach your full 100% genetic potential and not really be able to go any further without any sort of performance enhancing drug. So depending on what you want to do, your goal should be to reach your potential genetically for that thing. Will you ever know if you make it there? Maybe not, probably not. But you'll know that, once you start getting to a higher level of it and you just can't seem to make any more progress, which again, most people will never get to because they're just not dedicated enough to whatever it may be, then you can start to consider hey, maybe this isn't the right thing for me, or maybe, I need to consider getting some sort of chemical enhancement or whatever it may be. It really just depends on your goal. And not that I'm recommending that, but for example, allegedly Ronnie Coleman, his first Olympia, maybe his first couple of Olympias, he was allegedly natural. He was a former powerlifter before that, super jacked. He didn't place last and he was competing against obviously a bunch of non-natural guys, and he still beat several of them. So he already looked better than 99.99999% of bodybuilders in the world, even though he was natural, allegedly. And then when he started to take PEDs, of course, that just put him on a whole different level, whole different playing field. And he was unbeatable for those, I believe he won 8 Olympias. But that's just one example of reaching your genetic potential and then probably going beyond it. So kind of jumped around a little bit there, but genetics definitely play a big role. But just whatever you want to do, continue working at it. You may not be elite ever at a certain thing if it your genetics don't line up favorably for it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. You shouldn't strive for getting better because you can always improve. So that's all I'll say on that one. Next question. What is the proper way to decrease zone 2 pace over time? Is it natural or do you program it in? Yeah, so I have talked about this pretty much ad nauseum, but your pace in zone 2 is not really the goal. Your goal should not be to like hit a certain pace. It should be to hit a certain intensity. The adaptations from aerobic training or zone 2 training, whatever you want to call it, occur at a certain intensity, not necessarily a certain pace. So that intensity can be measured in many different ways. You can use heart rate. Heart rate is just a proxy though. It does not necessarily mean you're in zone 2. For example, if you have a panic attack and your heart rate gets up to 130 or 140 or 150, you're not in zone 2. You're not running. You're not getting zone 2 adaptations. If you were, you just have more panic attacks and you'd be super duper healthy. That's just not how it works. Or getting in a sauna, your heart rate will get higher in a sauna. Sauna does have cardiovascular benefits. And a lot of people say it mimics cardio, and I would beg to differ. I don't think you're going to get as many cardiovascular health benefits as actual cardio from going to the sauna, but your heart rate's higher. Are you in zone 2? No. So heart rate's just a proxy. It's a good proxy, but it's just a proxy. If you're working out and you're running and you're trying to get to a certain heart rate, yeah, you can rest assured that that's probably a pretty good proxy to use, but it's not just black and white. Like if your heart rate's at a certain rate, that doesn't always mean that you're getting aerobic benefits. You can use RPE. If you're more advanced and you are honest with yourself, RPE is usually the best option. More advanced runners typically know when they're going at the right intensity. If I tell an advanced runner, go for a 90-minute easy run, you can probably rest assured that they're going to be in a zone 2 aerobic base heart rate zone or intensity. If I tell a less advanced runner, hey, go for a run, but the entire time, every 5 to 10 minutes or so, say a 12-word sentence. And as long as you are not stopping mid-sentence to catch your breath, or as long as you're not like trying to rebound and catch your breath right after where you're like super out of breath for a second because you just said the sentence, then you're probably in zone 2. If you can nasal breathe the entire time, you're probably in zone 2. As for pace, your pace will naturally get faster over time when you are consistent with it, but it shouldn't be something that you aim for. And it's also not going to be a linear thing. For example, sometimes when I do easy runs, I am running closer to like an 8:15, 8:30 pace in zone 2. Those days, usually the weather is nice. It's nice and comfortable. Usually I'm well rested. Usually I am not sore. It's not the day after leg day or anything like that. And I feel pretty good that day. And I'm getting those adaptations at an 8:15, 8:20 pace. Other days when it's either hotter or I'm not as well rested, or perhaps I did legs the day before and I'm sore, I'll be running closer to a 9-minute pace, a 9:05 pace. That doesn't mean I'm worse or less fit. Doesn't mean I'm going backwards. It just means that's the pace and intensity that I have to hit that day in order to get the adaptations that I want. So it's always going to be this continuum that's going to be up, down. Eventually, over time, it is going to get faster, but not linearly. Some weeks you're not going to be as fast. Some weeks you might be extra fast. Some weeks you might feel extra slow, maybe really hot out and you're really struggling that week and it's, you're not used to the heat yet, or maybe it's like a really long run and you're going to be slower to stay in that zone 2, to stay in that proper intensity zone. So although your pace will inherently speed up over time, it's not the pace that you're going for, and you shouldn't program it. You shouldn't be upset if you are a little bit slower last week than you were the week before. A lot of like high level runners run their zone 2 at a much slower pace than you'd think. Some of them run it a little bit harder. They run, into 6-minute mile paces. Some of them run 7+ minute miles, 7:30. And these are guys who can run sub 5-minute miles for 26 miles in a row. So yeah, your pace is always going to be different. It's going to be individual as well. Some people are a little bit to a lot slower in zone 2, and they can still run really fast when they have to go for tempo runs or speed work, or if they're doing a time trial. So don't get too concerned about your pace. I know everyone is because it's a big ego thing, but at the same time, it's not that important. It will inherently get faster, but you shouldn't shoot for it. You shouldn't aim for it. Next question, too much fat and fiber close to training. Why is that a problem? Yeah, so the other day I did a run. I did what was supposed to be threshold work, and I messed up the timing. I had some calls in the afternoon, and I don't really like doing threshold work on an empty stomach. So in an effort to avoid that, I ate a meal, what I thought was enough time before my threshold work, but was not. So I had a meal with, normally I'm a little bit better and more calculated with this, and I don't eat the berries and the peanut butter that I had. Berries have high fiber, peanut butter is high fat. But I was, kind of lackadaisical with it. And I had a bunch of berries and I had a good amount of peanut butter, probably like 2.5 servings of peanut butter on a bagel. So fat and fiber both slow down digestion. And generally speaking, they are great. You want to eat lots of fat and fiber in general, but not necessarily around your training. You want fast digestion both before training and after training. After training is not quite as important, but before training, especially if it is training that involves hitting your lactate threshold, kind of higher intensity runs, you want to keep it to a minimum or just avoid it before training. Because when you're still digesting, your body is kind of putting its resources towards digesting food as opposed to putting its resources towards your physical performance. So more blood flow is going to your digestive organs than your peripheries, which blood carries oxygen to working muscles. And when it's not flowing as much to your working muscles that you want, your legs, etc., when you're running, your legs are just going to probably feel a little bit heavy. If you eat way too close, or if you eat too much fat and fiber, like too close to your runs, typically your stomach's not going to feel great. You might get some side stitches. You might have some sort of GI issue, whether it's diarrhea, burping, heartburn, maybe throw up, things like that. So typically you want to keep fat and fiber low pre-training, definitely during training if you're having intra-workout fuel. And then after training, optimally, you would also keep it low. You want to get carbohydrates that digest quickly as well as protein that is easily assimilated. So that's why whey protein whey protein is the fastest digesting protein there is, which is a good thing post-training, not necessarily a good thing if you're trying to eat more protein to be more satiated, because it's probably the least satiating type of protein you can have because it digests so fast. And also you're just drinking it. You're not doing the chewing thing, which typically chewing food is part of the satiety cascade that results in you feeling more content after eating. But either way, fast digesting stuff after a workout will allow it to get to where it needs to go. You'll be able to partition those nutrients faster. And especially if you're training later in the day, that's pretty important. If you're not training later in the day, it's less important. You can eat more fat, more fiber post-workout. But generally speaking, you want your fat and fiber to be high enough and sufficient, quality fats, good solid fiber from fruits, vegetables, grains, things like that. But if you have it too close to training, and that's going to be a different amount of time for everyone. For me, this particular workout was 2 hours prior. If I'd given it another hour or so, I probably would have been fine. Or if I just didn't eat as many berries, I could probably have a few of them and been fine. But if I just had honey on my bagel instead of honey and peanut butter, I probably would have been totally fine. But we all make mistakes. This is something I talk about a lot with my clients because they do workouts like this a lot. And sometimes they will wonder why they feel really sluggish or really shitty on a speed work session. And one of the things that we always identify is, or we at least cancel out, is their pre-training fueling. Whether they didn't eat anything, or they didn't eat enough pre-training, or they ate the wrong things, or they ate too close, or a combination of those things can all affect the way you feel on a run, the way you perform on a run. So that is what I meant. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, I'm not saying don't eat fat and fiber. I'm just saying don't eat fat and fiber too close to your workout, especially if you're doing some sort of threshold work or higher VO2 max work. Probably would have gotten away with it if it was a lower intensity run, but it was pretty rough on the higher intensity stuff. Next question, would incorporating some treadmill help transition back from break after shin splint? Yeah, I am a big fan of this. So I am not here to diagnose or provide a rehab plan for shin splints. However, assuming you're feeling good, assuming you are, you've taken the requisite time off from when the shin splints occurred and you're ready to get back into it, instead of just launching back into running on pavement or flat ground or whatever it may be, a great idea is to incorporate some treadmill on an incline. So the treadmill on flat is not, it's probably a little bit more forgiving than running on pavement or concrete or something like that, but it still wouldn't be where I start out. I would probably start out with like a walk run on an incline. What grade doesn't really matter all that much. I would say probably anywhere from like 5 to 8% incline. When you're running on an incline, it's less impactful because the running surface each time you take a step is a little bit higher than what it normally would be on flat ground. Definitely less impactful than running downhill. Running downhill can be pretty rough on the joints. Even though you can go faster downhill, it's not like less, it's a lot less forgiving. So I would start to implement runs on an incline, probably starting with walk runs, slowly increase the amount of the portion of that workout that you spend running till you can run the entire time. And then you slowly lower down the incline until you're running close to flat. And then once you're still feeling good from that, of course, following all the basic progression and intensity requirements and intensity parameters and not adding too much volume, not adding too much intensity week to week. Once you feel good when you're running on either 1% incline or flat treadmill, you can kind of opt to go outside. And still, the first time you go outside, I still wouldn't go on pavement. I would still probably shoot for like a gravel road or a hard packed dirt or even a track would be totally fine. All those are less impactful than running on pavement or concrete or whatever it may be, sidewalks. But eventually you can start slowly working your way towards running on whatever surface you want. I've actually had to do this with a few clients and it works out really well. It's a little bit painstaking and slow, but it is the right way to do it because shin splints, you don't want. The worst thing, mostly mentally, the worst thing is when your shin splints are gone and you start running again and you overdo something or you do something a little bit wrong and they start creeping back in. That's the worst because then you have to take another hiatus and it's just really, really annoying and not fun. So you want to take it a little bit carefully. You want to err on the side of caution. And I would probably start on a treadmill incline and then kind of go from there. You can use a curve runner as well. Curve runners are lower impact than a typical outdoor surface. So those are all options. Next question, could you elaborate a bit on the high, medium, low calorie day, nutrition-wise, more carbs on a run day? Yeah, so it could be on a run day. Basically, instead of looking at your calories on a daily basis, like a micro level, not micronutrient, but like on a micro as in like day by day level, this would be looking at it more on a week level. And this is appropriate for multiple different people. It's definitely appropriate for someone who has performance goals. Like if you want to get stronger, better at running, or a mix of both, then it makes the most sense to match your higher calorie days with your higher effort days and your lower calorie days with your lower effort days. It also makes sense on a practical and lifestyle level. Most people on certain days, they're going to want to eat a little bit more. Other days, they're going to want to eat a little bit less. So even if you don't have performance goals, this can be a good thing just to do for sustainability and psychological. Like on weekends, you might eat a little bit more on weekends. You might eat a little bit less on weekdays, and your net calorie intake for the week will still be appropriate. As long as your net calorie intake for the week is still appropriate for your goals, whether it's a calorie deficit, maintenance, calorie surplus, you're going to be good to go. A lot of people will tout that like carb cycling is like some magic thing for like body composition or something like that, and it's not. But it can be very beneficial for performance. So the way I like to do this is to manipulate mostly carbohydrates. Someone who's like really meticulous and really into this and really wants to do it perfectly, as close to perfectly as possible. I would also manipulate fat a little bit. So on the higher carb days, we go a little bit lower in fat. On the lower carb days, we'd have some more fat. Protein typically stays about constant. So you are manipulating your calories up or down by primarily switching carbohydrates. So maybe on your high days, you are eating 4,500 calories and 500 grams of carbohydrates. And, you know, maybe you're 200 pounds, so you have approximately 200 grams of protein. You fill in the rest with fat. Maybe on your medium days, you are doing, say, one workout, or you're doing a easier session, one single easier session, or maybe two sessions, but like maybe back to back, like a quick lift with a quick short. It could be intense, but not very long cardio session. That may be a medium day. And on that day, you would have, for example, about 200 grams of protein, maybe 375 grams of carbs, and fill in the rest with fat. And that would also be a lower calorie day than your high day. And then on your low day, maybe a rest day, or just like a really easy like shakeout run day, or, you know, you're doing 30 minutes of like low intensity cardio or something like that. that would be a low day, and you would keep protein about the same. You would care less about the fat and the carbs. I typically, with my clients, I have them just hit their protein and their calories on that day. If they want to eat higher fat that day, they absolutely can. If they want to eat higher carbs that day, they absolutely can, so long as they're eating sufficient fat, and kind of go from there. If you are really serious about it, yeah, you would probably keep your fat a little lower that day and your carbs a little higher, just to keep your carbs up, especially if you're a performance-based athlete. But that is kind of getting a little bit too into the weeds. So that's how you do it. A high day might be a day where you're doing 2 sessions, 2 like hour plus sessions, or you're doing a really long run, really long ruck, or maybe you're doing a lift plus a higher intensity conditioning session like intervals or something like that. You'd probably have a high day just to make sure you're well fueled. Medium day, again, would be 1 session or 2 shorter sessions. And then a low day would be a rest day or a very minor, easy workout. So that's how I would do it. Basically, you want to, depending on your goals, if you want to eat at maintenance, you want to make sure that your calories equate at the end of the week approximately to what you're expending. If you want to eat in a deficit, you probably want to average at least a 300 calorie per day deficit. So that would be a 2,100 calorie per week deficit. And then surplus, at least a 300 calorie surplus. I would say at least, probably for most people, at least 500. And that would be, 500 calorie per day. So 5 times 7, 3,500 calories per week surplus. So that's kind of how it would work. And I am actually very close to being done with my upcoming ebook on recovery and nutrition and preparation for selection, soft selection. That will be out in the next 10 days or so, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more. And that will be covered in detail. A lot of people, it's best to just do high and low days. But if you want to get really meticulous with it, you can do high, medium, and low days, and you're probably going to be a little bit more quote unquote optimal. Next question. When you say zone 3 incurs higher levels of fatigue than zone 2, is that musculature or aerobic? Yeah. So the type of fatigue doesn't matter all that much. There's several types of fatigue that are incurred by training. You've got musculoskeletal fatigue. So your muscular system, your joints, and soft tissue. You've got, he said, aerobic fatigue. Usually that's called cardiovascular fatigue, but you can call it either one. Your cardiovascular system gets fatigued from working and being stressed in a session. You've got metabolic fatigue or substrate fatigue, where you are expending glycogen that needs to be replenished. So that is another type of fatigue. You've got psychological fatigue. Certain types of training are more psychologically or mentally fatiguing than others. Just the lead up to it is more mentally stressful. And also while you're doing it is more mentally stressful. Think of like if you're about to go for a 45-minute zone 2 run versus you're about to do 6 800 meter repeats. Obviously that 6 by 800 meter repeats is going to be way more painful and miserable if you do it right. And therefore, it's probably going to cause more psychological stress leading into it as well as doing it. It's just going to be more, you can't get yourself ramped up for workouts like that nearly as often as a 45-minute super easy run. So that would be mental fatigue. And then you have nervous system fatigue. Your central nervous system is fatigued from any type of training, to include conditioning. And, the harder you're running, the more fatiguing it's going to be. The easier you're running, the less fatiguing it's going to be. So those are all involved. There's probably some more types of fatigue as well that I'm not talking about, but those types of fatigue are all involved in training. So if you're going at a high intensity, zone 3 versus zone 2, all of those things are going to be factors. You're going to be more fatigued in every single way like that. And therefore it's going to, the main reason you don't want to do that as much is because it's going to be more fatigue and you're not getting a lot of extra benefits as opposed to doing zone 2. You're getting about the same aerobic benefits from zone 2 as zone 3, but you're getting all that extra fatigue in all those different systems. And doing it once, not a huge deal. Doing it for a week, probably not a huge deal. For long-term running progress, probably a little bit more important. Especially if you're running a lot. If you're running a little bit, if you're running for an hour and a half per week total, probably doesn't matter all that much so long as you're recovering. Like if you want to run in zone 3, you can. I still probably wouldn't recommend it. I would use my time or use the time that I do spend running a little bit more wisely and run some zone 2 and then run some zone 4, maybe some zone 5 instead of hanging out in that zone 3, just because you're not getting many benefits from it. But it's especially important if you are doing a lot of running. and you are struggling to recover already, or if you're kind of on that line between like a little more would make it difficult to recover from, a little bit less, and I'm good. So I typically recommend when it's supposed to be zone 2, just stay in zone 2 for the most part. But don't freak out if you go into zone 3 for short periods of time. It's just going to be more fatiguing in multiple different systems, and you're going to have to put more into your recovery. You're not going to be able to do as much if you're running a lot. Next question, are tempo and threshold runs essentially the same thing or just a different terminology? So a lot of people use these terms interchangeably, and you can run tempo runs at threshold pace, but typically a tempo run is going to be a little bit slower and a little bit longer duration than an actual true threshold run. Tempo runs usually take place underneath a little bit slower than your threshold, and therefore they're a little bit less fatiguing. You can do them for longer and they are not going to beat you up as much. They also can get you really good at running right before your threshold. So it should be a pace that you can maintain for a good amount of time. I like to use tempo runs for my clients to get them used to running unknown distance, unknown time runs at selection, because you're just not going to know when you're almost done with the run. You're not going to have a watch on. You're not going to know your pace. You're not going to know how far you've gone. So if you can get used to running at that comfortably hard tempo pace, which I believe is like 75 to 80% of your maximum heart rate approximately, or you should be able to say, 4 to 6 words at a time, something like that, maybe 8 words at a time. If you get comfortable running there, that's a pace that you can hold for the duration that is required to run at selection. Once you hit threshold runs, which are slightly different, again, you can program like, hey, run this tempo run at your threshold pace, or run this tempo run slightly above your threshold pace. But once you hit to that threshold pace, depending on how fit you are, some people can hold threshold pace for a longer time than others, but it's going to be more fatiguing. You're not going to be able to hold it as long. Threshold runs are usually done a little bit shorter, especially if you're running a little bit over your threshold. You're not quite at like your VO2 max, but you're, over your threshold. I believe, technically speaking, threshold runs are supposed to be 80 to 85% or 80 to 88% of your maximum heart rate. You're not gonna be able to run that as long, and therefore it needs to be treated accordingly. So although they are similar and a lot of people use them interchangeably, and you can do tempo runs at threshold pace, they're a little bit different, technically speaking, but they're both beneficial. Just really depends on what your goals are and how you're recovering, and where you're going with your running. Next question, any interest in doing some ultra running events in the future? Yeah, so this has been something that's crossed my mind before plenty of times. I enjoy watching ultra running content. I listen to ultra running podcasts. The Coopcast is my favorite. If anyone is interested in this, I can't remember his full name, but something Cooper. And he's an ultra running coach, and he's very, very informative, and he brings some super smart people on, and I learn a lot about running from him and his guests. But either way, I've definitely been interested in the past. I've never bit. The main 2 reasons that I am not going to do this anytime soon. The first one is just the amount of time that you'd have to dedicate, that I would have to dedicate. Basically, when I train for something and I want to, actually pursue it, I'm going to go all in on it. I'm going to go hard. I'm going to dedicate the proper amount of time in order to get myself to a level where I can perform well in whatever I'm training for. With ultra running, the amount of time that you need to dedicate to training each week is astronomical. 100 miles a week would be a low volume for an ultra run prep. Think about how long that would take, 15 plus hours per week of training, most likely. I'm not great at math, but it would be something up there. Several hours per day of running. So right now, with all the things I have going on, starting a business and, my other training and living a life, being at least somewhat sociable and spending time with my wife and, leisure time, things like that. I just don't have the time for it. I could probably make it, but I would have to sacrifice some other things that I don't really want to sacrifice right now at the moment. So that's the main reason. The second reason is muscle mass. I have worked really hard over the last 12-ish years to gain probably about 25 pounds or so of muscle. And if I were to correctly train for an ultra, I would definitely, probably, for me to do well in an ultra, I would have to lose probably 15 pounds of muscle, maybe even more. And I'm just not interested in doing that at the moment. And my genetics are not super favorable for maintaining muscle even when I up my running volume a little bit, like right now, and I'm, 15 to 20 miles per week. If I were to up that, if I were to double that, I'd probably lose a little bit of muscle. I probably could maintain it if I was like really, really dialed in. But again, that's just like a bandwidth thing. I would have to be super dialed in with nutrition and eating enough food. And it's just not something I have the bandwidth for right now. But either way, for me to do well in an ultra, I would have to kiss some muscle goodbye. And I'm not really interested in doing that at the moment. That being said, sometime in the future, when I have a little bit more time and I get a hair up my ass to potentially pursue something like that, I would consider it. But at the moment, it's just not really on my near future to-do list or in my near future short-term goals. So I think ultra running, again, is like super cool and I'm very interested in it. And I feel like I could be pretty decent at it if I really pursued it, but I would have to sacrifice more than I'm willing to sacrifice at the moment in order to pursue it. So it's not going to happen super soon, maybe down the road. Next question, is Tabata mostly VO2 max work or is it more for glycolytic system development? All right, so we'll clarify this first. Although VO2 max training is geared towards improving your body's ability to utilize oxygen, so overall it's like aerobic, there's absolutely a glycolytic component. Glycolytic second energy system where you are using primarily carbohydrates or stored glycogen for fuel. So VO2 max training is for sure glycolytic. Try doing VO2 max work, which I'll get into in a second, on low carb, and it's probably not going to be super fun for you. So with that out of the way, Tabata is intended to be a VO2 max improvement type of training. Another thing we have to get out of the way too, Tabata training can only be done in certain ways. It can only be done using certain modalities. If you're doing Tabata squats or push-ups or crunches or anything other than certain types of cardio, it's not Tabata. Just because you're working for 20 seconds and resting for 10 seconds, that does not mean it's Tabata. The creator of Tabata, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Tabata, would be absolutely appalled seeing some of these influencers posting their Tabata like crunches and glute kickbacks and push-ups and whatnot. That's not how it works. You're not going to improve anything other than, your ability to do glute kickbacks, I guess. Doing Tabata glute kickbacks, you might be much better off doing, some RDLs or some squats or some hip thrusts or something like that. But either way, Tabata has to be done using certain modalities. So it has to be done using something that allows you to get your heart rate very, very cranked up. It has to be done using something that allows you to get above your VO2 max. I believe the original prescription for Tabata is like 170% of your VO2 max or something like that. So you have to be either running on a treadmill or a hill or a sprint all out. You have to be on a bike. An air bike is probably the best tool for Tabata. You can use a rower, you could use a ski erg, you could use any cardio machine that allows you to really go all out, like balls to the wall. You can't do it with burpees. Burpees are not intense enough. There's not enough constant, continuous cyclic movement for burpees. Kettlebell swings do not count. It has to be some sort of form of classic cardio. So that is the proper way to do Tabata. And then the way you're doing it is 8 minutes total. No, Tabata is 4 minutes. You go all out for 20 seconds, then you rest for 10. You go all out for 40 seconds or 20 seconds, rest for 10. So you're doing 8 total rounds and it's going to take you 4 minutes. The problem with Tabata is no matter how fit you are, you're going all out for you. Someone really fit, their all out's going to be way faster and produce more power, be at a faster pace, whatever you're using for metrics, than someone who's not fit, but it's all out. So either way, by the time you get later into the session, because you're only resting for 10 seconds per round, you're not going to be able to go anywhere near that same pace that you were going at the beginning. So because of that, it's not allowing you to spend enough time close to your VO2 max as you would be able to doing actual VO2 max training, which is something like 4 to 6 minutes, where you're going pretty much as hard as you can for that 4 to 6 minutes. And then you're resting long enough in order to repeat it, doing it again, resting long enough in order to repeat it. Obviously, the less trained you are, the fewer rounds you want to go. The better trained you are, the more rounds you're going to want to go, and probably the less rest you're going to need. But you're going to need more than 10 seconds rest. A VO2 max workout would be something like you run as hard as you can for 4 minutes, and then you rest probably anywhere from like 3 to 5 minutes, and then you repeat it again. Maybe you do 4 to 5 rounds of that. Or you can do it on a bike, an air bike, regular bike. You could do it on a rower, really anything you want. But you are going probably close to 90% of your max heart rate, maybe even a little higher, and it is pretty miserable. When you do that, because you're resting long enough and because you're spending long enough time at your VO2 max, training that VO2 max, you're going to get a lot more out of it than doing it for 20 seconds, resting for 10 seconds. Because, you know, by the time you get to round 5, 6, 7 in that Tabata workout, you're not going to be able to push the intensity high enough because you're not resting long enough. So if you're really crunched for time, that crunch for time where you only have 4 minutes, is it better than nothing? Yes. Is it going to move the needle much in your VO2 max? No, not compared to actual VO2 max training. So I would not consider Tabata to be a great use of your time for VO2 max training. Again, it's not useless, but at the same time, you are much better off, you know, taking an extra 15, 20 minutes of your day and actually doing VO2 max intervals. You know, you could do like 1 mile as hard as you can, run, and then rest for about the same amount of time, then do another mile, call it a day. That's a pretty damn good workout, pretty damn brutal, and it's going to move the needle a lot more on your VO2 max than the Tabata workout would. Next question, would squatting once a week be enough stress to get stronger at the lift? Doing a 5x5? Yes, it is enough to get stronger. You absolutely can get stronger at any lift if you do it once a week. Is it optimal? No. You are much better off with higher frequency than that. For a lift like a squat or any sort of lift that involves skill like that, you want to favor a little bit more frequency because of the skill component. So even if you do the exact same amount of sets at the exact same loads every single week, but you do it spread out over 3 sessions versus 1, you're going to get better because you're going to practice it more frequently. You're going to get more time under the bar than if you just do it 1 time per week. So although you definitely can gain strength, you probably want to do it at least twice per week. You may even be able to do it 3 times per week. Some people maybe even 4 times per week. What it really depends on most is a few things. Your overall strength. Someone who's super strong and has been squatting for a really long time and, you know, their 5x5 is done with like 500 pounds or something like that, they probably will be better off leaning towards that 2 times per week because they're already really skilled in the squat. They don't need a ton of skill improvement. And when you have that much weight, even if it's the same relative load compared to like it's the same relative percentage compared to someone who's weaker, it's still going to be a lot more fatiguing for them. Just that absolute weight that they have on their back is going to add a lot more fatigue, going to be more difficult to recover from. If you're weaker, you can get away with a lot more. So, you know, if your 5x5 is 200 pounds and you're doing that 3 times per week, you probably absolutely can get away with it so long as your other training isn't crazy excessive and your outside the gym habits are solid. So if you have good, solid outside the gym habits, you're not crazy strong, and you really want to get your squat numbers up, I would definitely lean towards at least twice a week, probably 3 times per week. You can probably get away with 4, depending on how much you want to specialize in the squat. I am assuming since you're only doing it once per week, you have other goals as well. So you always have to factor in all of your other training. But because of the skill component primarily, you want to, generally speaking, spread that volume out. And if you're only doing 5 sets of squats per week too on one day, it's not enough volume to like really move the needle all that much. Whereas if you do maybe 5 sets of squats on Mondays, 5 sets of squats on Wednesdays, and 3 sets of maybe lighter squats on Fridays, you're going to have more time under the bar. You're going to get more time to practice, but also you are going to be doing, 12 to 14, 15 sets per week as opposed to 5. And it's going to just that amount of volume is going to allow you to gain more strength in that lift. Next question, tips to maintain fitness when spending a lot of time in the field every other week. Yeah, that's rough. In the field, for those who are not aware, in the field is an Army term. You go out into the field and you are usually living off the land and doing a bunch of training. You're not going home to your bed at night. You're usually not sleeping as well or as much as you typically would. You are not eating the same amount of food, or you're usually eating MREs or some other field foods. So it's not ideal and also you typically don't have access to, you definitely don't have access to a gym. You might be able to bring certain things out, which I'll get into in a second, but going out there every other week is rough. First thing I'd recommend is trying to go somewhere else and get a new job, whether that's going to selection or whatever it may be, because you don't do that every other week in SF. But for now, in the meantime, you can rest assured that if you are really sound with your training and lifestyle habits in the weeks that you are home and you're super dialed in, you train hard, you sleep well, you eat well, you manage your stress well while you're home, even if you have to just do that every other week, and the other weeks you're not really training at all or training minimally, which I'll kind of talk about here in a second, you're still going to make progress. You still can absolutely make fitness progress training hard every other week. Of course, it's not optimal. It's not ideal, but it is far better than just kind of throwing in the towel and not doing it. While you're in the field, if you can bring little things like a TRX strap or maybe a couple kettlebells or some adjustable dumbbells, you're obviously hopefully going to be able to run ruck, run sprints, run hills, something like that. Just doing a little bit of maintenance, even if it's like, 30 minutes a day of doing some kettlebell squats, some push-ups, maybe some pull-ups if you can find a tree branch or something to do pull-ups on. Or if you have a TRX strap, you can do an upper body TRX workout. You can do some walking lunges or squats with your ruck on. Really anything to maintain those movements and get some sort of physical exercise in is going to be even better than just taking that whole week off. So basically think of it this way. When you're home, be super dialed in with your fitness and your outside the gym activities. When you're in the field, just do your best. If you can bring little things that allow you to add load to your frame in the form of kettlebells, dumbbells, bands, whatever it may be, and get that in, then you're going to be even better off. But at the same time, I am assuming and hoping that you're not going in the field every other week indefinitely. So the periods of time where you have more time sleeping at your house and eating your own food and access to a gym, take those times really seriously and really put in some good work and make some big fitness gains. And then when you go back to your bi-weekly field schedule, just do your best to maintain, but you can still gain fitness. It's just going to be a little bit suboptimal. It's not going to be perfect. Next question. What's your recommendation for pre and post run dynamic warm up, post run static stretch? It depends on what the intensity of your runs are. What I normally do for a lower intensity run, I don't think it's necessary. You just start running a little slower and slowly, gradually build your speed up until you're at your zone 2 pace. And then you can stretch afterwards if you want, but totally optional. For higher intensity stuff, you want to do a little bit more. What I normally do is probably the bare minimum. I do an easy, slow run, usually about 3/4 of a mile to a mile, sometimes a mile and a half. Then I'll do some strides. Strides basically is just when for a short duration, you speed up to your goal pace for that day. So for example, say I'm running repeats at like a 6:30 pace that day. I'll do 4 to 5 strides where I start in a jog. I speed up to that 6:30 pace, give or take, and I hold it for 30 to 40 seconds. And then I slow back down to a jog, rest a little bit, do it again. That just gets me used to running at that pace instead of just doing that slow run where you're only used to running slow. So it just gets you warmed up a little bit better. You definitely can do certain pre-run dynamic warm-up drills. You can do some skips, some hops, some pogo hops, some cadence drills, whatever it may be. Lots of different options. You can YouTube it. That's another great option. I would at least do an easy run, maybe some strides pre-run. Post-run, you absolutely can stretch. There's nothing wrong with it. What I normally do is just after I finish my speed work, I'll do a cool down where I just run really, really slow, like back to my house. My goal is kind of to get from like a really high heart rate back down into zone 2. And then I'll just, walk it off for the rest of it. So that kind of allows me to get from sympathetic to sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, where you're all jacked up for your speed work, back down into a parasympathetic state, which will like kick off the recovery process and make you feel a little bit better instead of just going from like a super high heart rate and just being done and being back to a low heart rate. You can stretch if you want. There's nothing magic about stretching. Stretching properly, breathing through it and being intentional with it can help you get back into that parasympathetic state, whether you're doing it after a lift or after a run, totally fine. But stretching, the primary goal with stretching is to improve your flexibility. So if you want to improve your flexibility, you can definitely stretch. And if you're going to stretch post-workout would be better than pre-workout. You can also stretch other times of the day, but typically you don't want to do static stretching right before a high intensity workout unless you have a bunch of time in between like your last stretch and when you start. A lot of people will say like never stretch before lifting, never do static stretching before lifting. But as long as you are not finishing your last stretch and then going right into your like heaviest, most demanding lift of the day, because stretching studies show that static stretching will in the very short term reduce your maximal strength, your maximum ability to produce force. So as long as you're not doing that, maybe you're doing some static stretching, then you're doing a more dynamic warm up, then you're doing maybe a lighter isolation movement to get warmed up a little bit, maybe some hamstring curls or whatever. Then you're doing your squats, but you're not loading your bar with your max set that day, your top set. You're probably doing some warm up sets. So by the time you finish stretching to the time you do your very first rep of a squat, it's probably 25, 30 minutes. So you're going to be totally fine. Most of the studies is like literally stretching right before, and then they go into a maximum effort lift. So you don't want to do that, but as long as you have some time in between, you're going to be totally fine. But stretching post lift or post run can absolutely help your flexibility if you are inclined to improve your flexibility. And even if you're not, you can definitely stretch just to calm yourself down, get yourself into a parasympathetic state a little bit faster. But there are other things you can do as well. You can do breath work. You can do an easy run, cool down like I do, cool down with a walk. You can do some foam rolling, or you can do really anything that just makes you feel chill and calm and gets you back into that rest and digest and recover state. So those are all options. Nothing really magic about stretching, but totally fine. All right, we will make this the last question. When using heart rate to measure zone 2, should I allow heart rate to drift out of zone 2 in higher temperatures or keep it in zone 2, even if I have to run slower? Yeah, so no matter what, if the weather's warmer, most importantly, the dew point, I'm actually writing an article on this right now about heat training. If the dew point is higher than 75, even if the temperature is not much higher than 75, but the dew point is 75 plus, that is considered like extreme heat training. So for example, in North Carolina in the mornings this time of year for the next few months, although it's not all that hot in the morning, temperature wise, it's very, very humid. So the dew point is really high. So even if it's 80 degrees, but the dew point's 77, that's still considered heat training. Whereas if it's 100 degrees, but the humidity's low, the dew point's still probably going to be over 75. So that would be considered heat training, but they're both going to negatively affect your performance. They're both going to make your heart rate higher. For zone 2 work, your heart rate's going to be higher this time of year when it starts getting hot out, even at the same intensities. And there are a couple options. You can either just continue with the higher heart rate that you're a little bit pushed out of zone 2 and just accept the fact that the reason that your heart rate is higher is not because you're not in as good a shape. It's just because your body's under more stress because of the heat. Your cardiovascular system is working harder to keep your body cool, and it's under more stress. So your heart rate is just going to be inherently higher. Think about going in a sauna. You go in a sauna and sit perfectly still, your heart rate's going to go up because it's keeping your body cool. Your heart is working harder to pump blood to the peripheries, to the capillaries, to release that heat through sweat. So you can either accept it and be okay with being a little bit higher than zone 2, even though you are still putting about the same effort in, or you can slow down a little bit and run a little bit slower than you normally do and just accept the fact that you're only running slower to keep your heart rate below zone 2 and probably recover a little bit better from that workout, be a little bit less stressed from that workout. How to decide really just depends. I typically just recommend deciding based on how you're feeling. If you're feeling like the extra heat is just smoking you and it's a lot of effort to stay at your normal zone 2 pace and normal zone 2 effort, then I would probably slow down, because you got to think of your workouts later that week, the next day, the following day, etc. All of the training that you do throughout the week will affect the subsequent training that you're doing throughout the week. So if you always only just stick to the plan and you never make changes on the fly based on how things are going, based on, how you slept that night, how your effort feels, how your body feels, the temperature, etc., then you are doing yourself a disservice. And you're also it's a really important thing to learn as someone who wants to train certain things for a long period of time, is to auto-regulate and make changes on the fly based on how your body's feeling and how you're performing that day. So if you're feeling like that, then I would probably dial it back and slow down a little bit and just drop your ego. Be okay with going a little bit slower that day just because it was super hot out. If you're feeling phenomenal and your heart rate's a little bit higher, but you feel really, really good and you've been recovering well and you test this out a couple times, this is the thing. You want to test these things out. If 1 week you do runs and you allow your heart rate to drift up above zone 2, but you feel like you recovered poorly that week, or it affected other training more than it normally does, then maybe a better option would have been to slow down a little bit. And so you can try that next week. Get into your next week of training, keep that heart rate inside your aerobic range, and see how you recover, see how you feel overall from your entire week of training. If you feel better that week, then maybe you should lean more towards that. So there's never like a perfect, yes, you should do this, no, you should not do this answer. It usually just depends on the situation, how you're feeling, how you're recovering, and how much it's affecting other training. So that's kind of how I would decide. If you're like a high level runner that had like major running goals, I'd probably suggest being a little bit more calculated with it. But for most people, it doesn't matter all that much. You can kind of just go based on feel and experiment with different things. And that experimentation process is highly valuable for your long-term training success and progress and recovery and just good things to know. So that's what I would do. And that's it. That's the last question today, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'll be back soon with another episode. Till then, Terminator out.